Cultural Relativism or Cultural Imperialism, discussing universal human rights in the context of a globalized world. By Austin Piatt
and Jordan Cohen.
Have you ever wondered, do we have universal human rights? And have you ever wondered the follow-up question? In such a multicultural world, wouldn't any attempt to impose a universal set of rights be ethnocentric, that is, favoring the values of one culture over another?
We should not abandon universal human rights as groundless and ethnocentric in favor of cultural relativism, and we argue it is incorrect and actually harmful to assume that human rights talk is culturally imperialistic. Why is this an important point to argue?
Some people say universal human rights are culturally imperialistic and culturally insensitive. Makua Mutua argues that the human rights movement is marked by a damning metaphor, the metaphor of savages, victims, and saviors. The savages are non-Western cultures that do not endorse the values of liberty and democracy, instead endorsing an authoritarian state. The victims are all peoples helplessly oppressed by such savage states. They are the damsels in distress awaiting a Western savior. Such a conception of human rights, Mutua argues, is harmful and counterproductive. In fact, the idea of universal human rights is both culturally imperialistic and culturally insensitive.
One alternative to avoid cultural imperialism is cultural relativism. What is cultural relativism? As a variant of ethical relativism, cultural relativism denies the possibility of truth in ethics by relativizing all moral judgments about social behavior to each culture's prevailing beliefs about them. For example, a cultural relativist would say Western philosophers should not make normative claims about African values. Cal believes cultural relativism is an oversimplification. For example, Asian and African cultures revere their elders, but Inuit communities participate in senilicide. What could be more different? What if we consider the moral underpinning of each of these practices? Both Inuits and non-Inuits share a morality that says that a prolonged life without dignity or health is a poor quality of life. Inuits are respecting their elders by relieving them of the burden of terminal illness. Cow also believes that cultural relativism is imperialistic in its own way. The notion of tolerance pervades talk of cultural relativism, but this in and of itself is a Western ideal. Cow also believes that cultural relativism is a shield for established cultural practices that are harmful. For example, child marriage may be understood to be a cultural norm in some African cultures, but voices of dissent, the Ghanaian Association for Women's Welfare among them, indicate that this practice is not even nationally accepted. Here's the crux of the problem with relativism. Who is hurt when we allow for a culturally relative notion of the good, the most marginalized in any given culture? Remember, it is not the most disadvantaged who are dictating the norms in a society, it is the most well-off. Cultural relativism as a thesis might now only be descriptively problematic and prescriptively incoherent, but might also be pernicious to the extent that it could be deployed to shield certain harmful but well-entrenched social practices from external critique. Another problem Cow identifies is that cultural relativism overlooks voices of dissent. For example, female genital mutilation in Ghana is understood to be a culturally normative practice that we as Westerners only find abhorrent because it is not practiced in our own culture. The Ghanaian Association for Women's Welfare, an initiative of Ghanaian descent, would disagree.
Because of the reasons illustrated by Cal, we don't want to adopt cultural relativism. So what do we do about the argument that universal human rights are imperialistic? We argue that we should reject this charge altogether. For this, we turn to Sen. One of Sen's main arguments is that a monolithic depiction of, quote, the East, used by some cultural relativists to justify their approach, is a misguided illusion. The fact that some thinkers assume the East and the West can be boiled down into a singular conception of culture is nearly offensive to the diverse and various billions of people living in Asia, where 60% of the world's population lives. Cal argues that it is a misconception that the East rejects the values of liberal democracy in favor of communitarianism and authoritarianism. For example, one such thing that might lead to this misconception is the fact that at the 1993 Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, a spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry stated, quote, "Individuals must put the state's rights before their own," end quote. Statements such as these further perpetuated the idea of a one-sided Eastern culture of authoritarianism. In fact, Sen points out that the early writings of Eastern leaders, such as Ashoka, king of India, openly endorsed freedom and tolerance early on in history. So talk of human rights not being universalizable is in fact harmful to the people of different cultures who do wish for freedom, democracy, and other such rights. In conclusion, we argue that universal human rights should not be abandoned in favor of cultural relativism, because, as Cal points out, cultural relativism can lead to the perpetuation of harm for marginalized groups in any given society. We also reject the charge that universal human rights are culturally imperialistic because, as Sen illustrates, the cultural divide between East and West is largely an illusion. Therefore, we should endeavor to promote universal human rights across the globe for the betterment of marginalized individuals. Failing to do so leaves them defenseless against their own cultural norms.